Hi everybody, this is Michael Hildebrand and I'm your host on the Sleeptrust podcast, where I'm talking about how to gain back trust in your ability to have a superb sleep again.
In this week's episode of the Sleeptrust podcast, we are going to talk about melatonin. Top or flop, hot or not, does it work? And I think that's a fair question. If you've been struggling with bad sleep in the past, or if you're a shift worker, if you travel a lot, then odds are that you stumbled over melatonin because it is the probably most hyped sleep supplement that you can take. So it's fair to ask, does it deliver on the promise? And to start off, we're going to walk through what melatonin is, how it works, and what we need to know about melatonin to really get the most out of it. And then we're going to see, okay, in which cases does it work? In other cases, it might not work as well, so that you can make a better decision. Number one, what is melatonin? First off, it's important to understand that this is a hormone. Other than most supplements that you might be taking or consider to take, or that you can get available in the drugstores, we're not talking about a vitamin, we're not talking about a mineral. This is a hormone, and hormones have a different impact in our body. So even if melatonin is claimed to be safe, consider that it's a different level of supplement. And that's why I would also recommend that you always ask a healthcare professional, a doctor, if it's appropriate for you to take melatonin, if it's going to serve you, because even if it's claimed to be safe, nobody can tell you if it really is for you in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So that's the intro to this podcast. And now let's see what melatonin is. So melatonin is formerly known as the sleep hormone. And what it does is actually it does not set us to fall asleep, but it kind of transports the message into our body, because sleep is a very complex process. It transports the message that it is time to sleep, so that other mechanisms in our body can align and adjust to that and build that road back to or into sleep. It gets produced in a part of our body, in our brains actually, that is called the pineal gland. And the production of melatonin is dependent on light. In particular, it's blue light. So if there's blue light available, if we get that information in our eyes, we've got special receptors for that. They really pick up on that blue light, hand that information into our brains to let our pineal gland know if it's time to produce melatonin or not. So as long as our eyes pick up on that blue light, the signal is clear to our body that it's still daytime. And that's what we need to understand. Like if we're exposed to sunlight and or also light inside of our houses, light bulbs typically emit blue light spectrum. Our screens emit blue light. So if we're exposed to blue light, our eyes pick up on that, hand that information over to our body, and they signal our body that it's still daytime, preventing our pineal gland to start the melatonin production. So that's how it works. Sunlight on, melatonin production off. Sunlight down, melatonin production kicks in at some point. Besides of this factor, we also have our inner clock, right? So our bodies are, everything in nature essentially is aligned in rhythms, and our body is the same. Like we have this rhythm, the 24-hour circadian rhythm, and we're into that. So our body kind of gets a feeling for when it's time to sleep, when it's time to get up. And light is just a synchronizing factor and a factor that gives in a very important information, but it's not all to it. We've also got our inner clock, the SCN, that has like a drum beat going. And those two things, we want to keep them synced. So now let's have a look at what happens when we're traveling. Let's start with that one first. You get into a plane, you fly to some other place, and now instead of 6 p.m., your time, it's now 10 p.m., nighttime where you are, and it's time to go to bed. And you need to get to bed because you need to get up the next day because you're on holiday or you have to work, right? So what you want to do here is, or what you can do here is, and what you definitely want to do is to go to bed on time. Like you do not want to stay up as long as you can, but rather you want to get into the dark, get away, get out of light, be very disciplined around this, and supplementing yourself with a little bit of melatonin, half an hour or up to an hour before you go to bed, might be helpful to help your body to get into the new time rhythm. That said, it does not necessarily have to help, so you really want to test and play around with this because there's also this inner drumbeat. But that's a thing you can definitely try, and I know helps some people. Number 2, if you're a shift worker, first off, coming back to the drumbeat, if your shifts constantly change, you're really going to have a hard time to let your body cope with this. So it's best to have shifts that don't constantly rotate. But now let's say you've got a shift and your shift is just that, gives you your sleeping time at daytime. There are studies out there that have proven that melatonin can help you to fall asleep faster and get a better sleep quality. I would always recommend before you go to melatonin that you play with sunlight, or not play with sunlight, you change your environment, that you're really in the dark, that you're lying in the dark, that when you get home and it might be daytime and you have your dinner or whatever it is, that you start to eat that in a darkened room if possible. Like, you need to get yourself out of sunlight. If you hop around outside and then you move towards your bathroom bed from sunlight, like let's say it's noon and you move to your bed after that, odds are that's not going to work. So even if you supplement your body with melatonin, it might help you to give you that trigger to push you into sleep, but odds are your body's going to know it's daytime, and that will not give you the sleep quality you need. So rather work on your environment first. And if you don't see the results there, or you want to see if you can notch up on your sleep quality, then start to supplement your with melatonin. Same rule here, half an hour to an hour before you go to sleep. Supplement yourself with melatonin and see if it works. Number 3, and this is quite interesting because this is where melatonin also gets, I would nearly say, misused or misunderstood probably. And that's why they're selling it like crazy, right? If you've got sleeping problems of any kind, at some point you stumble over melatonin and say, okay, let's try that. And I did a poll, must have been a year ago in the insomnia group on Facebook, where I asked, what's the number 1 overrated sleep tip? And I didn't have any predefined answers. And 1/3 of these people, and there were like 100 to 200 people replying to this thing, 1/3 of them said melatonin, the number 1 overrated sleep tip. So that got me curious. Like till then, I was like a little bit skeptical and knew where you can use it. I was skeptical about, how people use it, but that kind of really got my focus on the topic. So after that, I set up a poll to my followers in an email and just asked them oh yeah, by the way, if you've got experience with melatonin, share with me if it worked for you or not. And out of my followers, 90+% said it did not work. 90+%. And one doctor came back to me in that poll, which was really kind of him actually, and said, oh yeah, it does work. I've got patients, it works. And then I asked this doctor, so how many people of this are using it successfully from the people that you prescribe it to? And he didn't come back to me on that one. So we'll say, I think it's overhyped. I think it's also overhyped with doctors because there's no real checkpoint to see how often it works. And if you consider the placebo effect, which is always placebo is a great thing, by the way. Don't underestimate the placebo effect here. But if you bring that into the equation and say, okay, from those people that doctors prescribe melatonin to, a certain percentage it works for because of the placebo effect, because they think it's going to work, and that's why it works. It's a big problem, not measuring. So from your gut feeling, yeah, it worked. Somebody told me it worked, but you don't know how many people it didn't work for. And if you count in the placebo effect to all of this, it's really questionable for how many people this will work. It will only work in specific settings if people have specific insomnia, like a delayed sleep phase syndrome, where your sleep stages are just delayed, or sleep phases rather, and your body produces melatonin too late in the night. Stuff like that can be helpful, but that's not the major people of having sleep problems. So very important to understand here that if you're suffering from bad sleep, odds are it will not help you. Like if you tried a lot and you've got your environment right, if you've went through CBTI or something like the Sleeptrust system, where there's a very coherent way and a very practical way to move through things that you need to have in place to improve your sleep quality. And if you can check off the boxes and that didn't work, then you might want to add in melatonin, see if it works for you. But I would not pick it as or recommend it as the first option to go, but rather on the later end after you tested things that you can do with your behavior, with your environment. So now that we walked through all of this, what are we going to make out of it? So when is melatonin top and when is it a flop? And sadly, for most of you listening to this, melatonin is not going to work. You rather want to focus on your environment, get rid of light at the evening, go to bed at a consistent time, and do the things that, as an example, you will find with the Sleeptrust sleep map. You can download that for free. There are 9 specific steps you need to do in a specific order to find back to superb sleep. Far more helpful for most of you. Now, if you are suffering from a sleep disorder that is related to your body rhythm, to the circadian rhythm, like a delayed sleep stage disorder, then taking melatonin can make a lot of sense. But to know exactly, you really want to talk to a sleep professional, sleep expert. You probably want to go to a sleep laboratory and get your blood measured overnight to see when melatonin kicks in and in which amount, to know exactly and to stop the guesswork. If you are working shifts, it might make sense. Like there are studies out there that claim that it makes sense to take melatonin. So number one, I would focus on your environment, get out of sunlight, try to give your body a little bit of time to adjust to that. So try to have your dinner where it's darkish, that you don't hop from sunlight into bed. And if that doesn't work, or if you find that you want to try something to raise your sleep quality, you might want to try melatonin. But do so by talking to your doctor and by measuring what you're doing. Number 3, jet lag. If you're traveling a lot, it might make sense. Like this is probably the best use case because you're switching to a new time zone. It goes very fast. Our body clock cannot adapt that fast. And melatonin might be a helper that you want to consider to give your body that little edge to adapt to the new time zone a little bit faster. But that said, also more important, be very diligent with your bedtime, be diligent with getting up at the same time. And that said, if you cannot fall asleep, now it's 3 a.m. in the morning, 5 a.m. in the morning, and you feel that you cannot fall asleep, just get up and do something. Like don't toss and turn in your bed, get up, do something. Odds are next night, sleep pressure is going to build up. There are other mechanisms that will help you to fall asleep the next night and stay asleep. So the more diligent you are with not tossing and turning in bed, but sleeping in bed and getting up at the same time, going to bed at the same time, the faster your body will adapt, the better you will experience sleep, even if you travel. And if you want to use and try melatonin, might be a good idea. And there's still one thing we want to have a look at. That is, how much melatonin do we want to take? And there's no 100% clear answer. Like if you look at different experts, different countries, you get different recommendations. But on average, I would say you start low. That's a general rule. Start low and ramp it up from there if you need to. And you start low, and low is 0.5 to 1.5 milligrams of melatonin. That's the lower range. If that doesn't work, you can notch it up to 3 milligrams per night, per day, 3 milligrams. And if that doesn't work, you can move up to 5. The maximum dosage seems to be by 10 milligrams. And before you move into that direction, I would definitely recommend talking to a doctor. Also, you should not take melatonin longer than 2 weeks without consulting a doctor. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. And with that, let's wrap up this week's episode of the Sleeptrust podcast. If you have experienced bad nights of sleep in the past, then odds are that you stumbled over melatonin at one point or another. Melatonin can help to improve sleep quality if the sleep disorder is rooted in a disturbed daytime-nighttime cycle. This can typically be the case if you're suffering from delayed sleep phase syndrome, or if you're a shift worker or you travel a lot over time zones. In any case, take the melatonin 30 to 60 minutes before you hit the bed and start with the low dosage. And that's it for this week's episode of the Sleeptrust podcast. I hope you enjoyed yourself and that you tune in next time. Until then, have a superb sleep.
Hey there, and thanks for listening to the Sleeptrust podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you want to get further information on this podcast or material that will help you to gain back your sleep trust, please check out sleeptrust.eu. That's sleeptrust.eu, where you will get lots of information around sleep. And here comes some legal stuff. Everything on this podcast is my opinion only, so do not take it as an advice, as I am not a doctor, nor have I considered your personal situation. If you feel that you need medical advice, please consider getting an appointment at your doctor of trust. If you want to give me any kind of feedback on this podcast, feel free to email me at podcast@sleeptrust.eu. I hope you tune in again next week, and until then, have a good sleep.